In the last story of the day, because I'm absolutely fascinated by this, let me pull up this Wikipedia page, or yeah, probably a couple of them. So in this last story, I was listening to an audiobook. I was listening to a book, and this is not, I'm really not trying to sell you this book. You're welcome to buy it. I am going to provide a link. But I was listening to an audiobook on the history of espionage and covert operations. And as we're getting towards the end of the book, as we're getting further and further into modern history, we came across the East Germany Stasi, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, or the Staatssicherheitsdienst. No, I cannot pronounce German, as you've discovered. It was the Ministry for State Security, the State Security Service, and it was abbreviated the Stasi. And it was the official state security service of the German Democratic Republic, also known as East Germany. What the heck is East Germany? East Germany, West Germany, North side, East side. No, this really was a thing at the end of World War II. Somebody can correct my simplified version of history, please. But in the end of World War II, you had Berlin was basically split into two, and the Russians controlled the east side, and I think our allies controlled the west side. And as I think the Russians were pulling out, there was something about building a wall, and somehow the Berlin Wall got built, literally a wall going straight through the city, and half the people lived on one side under one government, and half the people lived on the other side under a completely different government. And the government of the East was a communist government. Communism having various different forms, and we're not getting into the politics of that, but this version of communism was quite fascist, was quite oppressive, and was quite scared of falling apart for any little thing, so strict compliance with the laws was required. And the laws, of course, because this is how governments work, you can just make things illegal, right? So it was illegal to be a political dissident. It was illegal to be a separatist. It was illegal to want to leave. It was illegal to speak out against your government. It was illegal to distribute posters or pamphlets or want to go to the other side of Germany, etc., etc., etc. There were some ways that you could go from East to West Germany if you had enough money and bribed the proper officials. Some of these bribes were made official, and you could look up the value of your profession and pay a tax and leave. But if you were poor, or you were unable to find, or find the appropriate way to make that bribe, you were stuck in East Germany. And this was not for some short period of time. This was from 1950 to 1990, from February of 1950 to January of 1990. So how did I come across this story? Now, of course, people who know history know that this happened and all that, but there's this one element of it that I really thought was very, very interesting and wanted to cover. There is the saying, "You're in the hot seat." It's usually used when someone is under interrogation or under the spotlight, when all eyes are on you, when the pressure is on you. You're in the hot seat. It's your time to shine. You might say, "I'm in the hot seat right now because everybody's watching me." No, that's not quite the way it means. It's more when someone's in trouble, um, and everyone is waiting to see how they're going to behave next, or what they're going to say, or how the interrogation is going to play out. And so we go through life and we use these phrases and we say things, and they're just phrases. We say these things. But I came across a story yesterday that I wanted to share. And the story was in this History of Espionage and Covert Operations by the Great Courses, and I have linked to it in the description. And the author slash speaker was going over the interrogation methods of the East German Stasi. And one of the things that they would do, because this was back before the internet, this was back before tracking devices, this was an era of lower technology, how they would find people and track people among many other ways. Well, let's start with some of the simple ways. They had lots of informants. They had approximately 1.5 to 2.5% of the population converted into political informants that would watch out for even the slightest disagreements with the political party, with the Communist Party, and they would report to the Stasi when they saw something. People would turn on their spouses, would turn on their children, would report their friends, their best friends for their whole lives. One person had problems their whole life with the Stasi, and it turned out that their best friend of 13 years had been reporting them to the Stasi for their own protection, they said, because the friend was protecting the dissident friend from their own inner whatevers. Very much the story of iRobot, where we try to give some control over to the robot population to take care of us, and instead they decide that in order to take care of us, they must protect us from ourselves, which means capturing us and controlling what we do. So in very much the same way, some people in East Germany convinced themselves that they were helping by informing on their neighbors when their neighbors had political disagreement, basically of any kind. We're not just talking about extreme political views or terroristic acts or anything like that. We're talking about just basic disagreements. Simply wanting to leave the country and wanting to travel somewhere else or wanting to move to West Germany was often seen as dissent and sedition itself, and was enough cause to then invade your home, literally invade your home, and search for additional evidence to hold you against your will without trial. The one book that I started to, I finished this one book on espionage and then started the book Stasiland by Anne Funder, who goes into great detail and has interviewed many first-hand sources. The one girl was a 16-year-old girl who thought it was funny to distribute some pamphlets, and she got caught and put into solitary confinement for 10 days. And when she was released, she tried to escape, and she actually made it across the border all the way to the other side before getting caught again. And then the real interrogation started, where they were absolutely infuriated that she had bypassed all their security so easily that they insisted that she had help. And they basically tortured her, not even basically, they tortured her, unconvinced that she had just crawled across the border and made it past a dog without help. And so she ended up having to make up a story in order to be allowed relief from the torture. And then when they discovered that she had lied about the having help, they were then even more infuriated because she had embarrassed them yet again. But then, at least because they were embarrassed and they didn't want the story to become public, they then eventually released her with a reprimand or whatever, with some kind of, you've paid for your crimes. I believe she was sentenced to 1.5 years though, just for trying to escape to West Germany. That would be like me trying to leave the U.S. to go to Canada and getting sentenced to U.S. prison for it. That's a weird thought. Now, certainly, Canada might not be too happy if I just walk onto their soil without any official permission or anything. I do get that there are formalities here, but in this time, there were no formalities like that. There was actually a way to apply for permission to leave, but like I said, if you didn't have a good enough reason, then it was seen as a front for sedition or dissent or even adversity, and you were then investigated, arrested, and confined. The people of all people that were allowed to leave without trouble, it was priests. The Stasi saw the priesthood as enough of a threat and low enough value that they pretty much helped them get out of East Germany in some cases, so that they couldn't help the populace come to their senses with regards to what was going on. So, what would they do to track political dissidents like our friend who spread leaflets? Well, people have various odors and fluids and such that their body puts off, just as a normal course of your skin sloughs off and you sweat a little bit and your breath smells and your hair has oils and stuff. And so what they would do, said there were several variations of this. What they would do is they'd bring someone in either for a voluntary interrogation, questioning, or they would bring you in after there was something that some incident had happened, or they had some kind of what they considered probable cause, which was almost next to nothing. You could almost basically make anything up, and they would consider that probable cause. So they would bring you in, and they would sit you down on a chair. And the chair was one of varied types of construction. Sometimes it was a chair that had a piece of cloth already on it, and sometimes it was a kind of metal or vinyl chair that had nothing on it whatsoever. And they would leave you on that chair for some time. Sometimes the chair itself was heated, sometimes the room was heated, sometimes it was just a hot room from lights and stuff like that. But either way, the point is that you would sweat and you would sit on that chair, and your smell would get impregnated into whatever was on that chair. If it was a piece of cloth, the piece of cloth would have your scent on it. If it was a vinyl or metal or something, they would wipe it down with a clean cloth later. And then they would store this cloth in a canning jar, like a pickle jar. Sealed, basically a sealed jar, and they would label it with the subject's information, and they would put it in a room where they have vault, where they had stored thousands of these scent markers. And when a young lady or young man or political dissident or just human being, just being a normal human being, would do something that they didn't like, they would do what they could to capture a scent from that object. If it was a pamphlet, you'd have an object. If an incident had happened, you'd bring a dog to try and mark on it, try and pick up a scent. And then they would bring that trained dog back to the vault and have the dog try to figure out which jar that matches the scent. I have no idea how accurate this was as far as whether a dog could really pick out your scent from one of 8,000 jars, but dogs are definitely much more able to track those sorts of things than we are, and they have often been used in the past to do that. So the Stasi would then match these things and then use that as evidence against you to make their case that you should be confined for a very long period of time as a political dissenter, as a separatist. And then, while you were in prison, because, just being in prison for having a difference of opinion isn't bad enough. While you were in prison, you were confined with the criminal perpetrators as well, the criminal convicts as well, who had actually committed, say, violent crimes. And the political dissenters were actually so disfavored that the guards would encourage the criminal convicts to attack the political dissenters. So it was all a vehicle to further oppress the people that were opposed to this kind of regime. And I thought this was a very interesting story. So when you hear someone say the hot seat, you can think of a person sitting in an interrogation room where interrogators hoping and waiting that they put enough pressure on you that not only do they get some kind of information out of you, but also they literally capture your scent on a towel or piece of cloth or whatever, so that you can be tracked back to a residence or back to a meeting location of dissidents, or your scent can be found on a poster or whatever, something that they disagreed with. They would track you with your scent. It was a very interesting place of history. Apparently, in 1990, after the Berlin Wall fell, the demonstrators, the protesters who had finally gained victory over the Stasi, allegedly stormed the Stasi headquarters, and they were there in such numbers that the Stasi surrendered. But in some kind of weird dystopian thing, the Stasi demanded to check the identities of the protesters. And the confused protesters turned over their identities to the Stasi, who are surrendering, before they took over the building and turned it into a museum. Frankly, it's a museum. It turned into a museum rather quickly, actually. I think it was like the next year. And you can now go to the museum. I didn't think ahead to bring it up here on the screen, but you could go ahead to the Stasi Museum, what used to be the Stasi headquarters for the secret police of the German Democratic Republic of East Berlin. You can go to that museum and see their headquarters and a lot of material and such from that time. And that sounds like a really interesting trip that I think I might like to make. If you would like to hear more, I am currently exploring this research topic through, I read a lot of books through Audible. I'm not trying to sell you on Audible unless you really like audiobooks. I think Audible's great. I pay $15 a month and I get an audiobook every month, so that's $15 for an audiobook. Or there's other programs where you can get them down to about $10 an audiobook if you really want. I have a link in the description for you can click on and go to Amazon, and you can purchase a copy of the book Stasiland by Anne Funder. Is that her name? Anna Funder. She interviewed a bunch of first-hand sources in East Germany who had survived the Stasi regime, and she wrote a whole book about it. So far I'm through chapter 3 or 4. Chapter 3 really picks up. The introduction is kind of slow, and then chapter 3 really picks up. So definitely check that out if you like. Another book recommendation I'm going to make is for the Bill Browder fans, whoever's been trying to follow the Bill Browder stories I've been doing. He wrote a book, Red Notice, which is all about everything that we just talked about in the last week's story.